UConn coming off a loss to Villanova, now getting ready to head down to DC to take on Georgetown, who looks to be an upstart in the Big East this year. So joining me once again on the podcast is Patrick Stevens, covers all things DMV basketball, and excited to have him back on. So Patrick, thanks so much for hopping on.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Georgetown seems to, I don't want to say quite come out of nowhere this Big East season, but I think it have taken people by surprise. When did you start to think that this Georgetown team, might be able to compete a little bit more in the Big East than it has in, the past few years here?
Well, I think it was kind of obvious early that they wouldn't be like 2-18 bad.
Yeah.
Um, I would say by the end of November, it felt like the way that they were playing and a few of the pieces that they had, whether it was Thomas Sorber, the freshman big, Micah Peavy, the grad transfer, who's done a lot of ball handling of late as their defensive stopper, whether it was Malik Mack, or Jaden Epps, who's hurt right now. But it seemed like that was a core four that they had that was at least going to keep them in games. And I think by the time that they played up at West Virginia on December 6th and hung around for a good, I don't know, 26, 27 minutes, and then
Mhm.
Sorber picked up a third and fourth foul really quickly, and it kind of unraveled from there. That was kind of a hint to me that, like, okay, like they went on the road and they didn't embarrass themselves.
Yep.
And those are the sorts of games that Georgetown had routinely embarrassed themselves, game after game after game for the last 3 years in particular. And so, from that, I'm thinking, well, there's a little bit more here. How much more? It was hard to say, just because the totality of the non-conference schedule to that point, besides really their worst performance of the year, which is a loss to Notre Dame, uh, hadn't been very good. And so then they go to Syracuse and they win, but Syracuse isn't really that good this season, and so
Yep.
you're kind of wondering. And then they go out and throttle Creighton. And it's like, oh, and Creighton's not quite right at this point. They were, and at that point in particular, they were still getting, Isaac was had been out only a
Yep.
couple games at that stage. So then they go and they survive Seton Hall when they have a bunch of injuries crop up, and any Georgetown team from the last 5 years would have lost that game. So even though Seton Hall's not that great, that still kind of showed something. So I feel like December sort of put that went from, well, there could be something here, to, well, this is at least sort of interesting,
Yeah.
as opposed to, well, how much is every visiting team going to win by when they come into DC this
Yeah, no, I mean, I think for me, just seeing them in the non-conference, not losing to the Holy Cross type
year?
teams,
Hmm.
is a big sign of progress there. Then just to see them be competitive with, a couple of those power teams that they played in the non-conference, led me to believe that hey, this Georgetown team won't be, the complete, bottom of the Big East this year. How's the fan support been as this team has been going on? When UConn comes down Saturday, I know they're used to playing in a relatively empty Capital One, and if anything, probably more UConn fans have been there the past couple of years than Georgetown fans. Are the fans starting to come back for this team?
There's a little bit more the last couple games. They drew an announced crowd. Now remember, Cap One seats a little more than 20,000. They generally don't have the upper level open, so the capacity for a typical Georgetown game is not really 20,000.
Yeah.
But the 20,000 seat arena, they announced a little more than five for Coppin State the Saturday after Christmas. They announced, I think it was about 6,600 for Xavier last Friday night.
Okay.
So that's certainly an uptick from some of the games where they were announcing 27, 2,800 early in non-conference play, and I promise you, it
There
was
were.
more like it was more like 600 or
Yeah.
700 people total. It was the Mount St. Mary's game, the St. Francis game. Those were some bleak crowds. So I suspect that Connecticut will have its share of fans that do show up. It is supposed to snow at least a little bit overnight into Saturday, so maybe that tamps down a little bit. But I
Mhm.
believe students are back on campus now. I think classes were supposed to start today or yesterday or something along those lines.
Okay.
So you're going to have at least a little bit of a student bump there as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of their two biggest crowds of the season. I think it was about 8,800 was the announced number for Notre Dame. So would not be surprised if it's at least the building's at least half full come Saturday afternoon.
All right, so we look at the matchup a little bit itself. The guy who pops off the page to me is Sorber, the freshman, who's really just established himself right away with this team. What does he mean to this team in the role that we'll see him play on Saturday?
Well, he's really polished, and yeah, I remember the first time I saw him in practice in the preseason, and it was striking just how well he moved for a freshman big. Like it just very fluid. He has a really good understanding of the game. I think that their dream or his dream is to be able to step out and maybe knock down a few more 3-pointers, and that really
Mhm.
hasn't been what he's been super effective at. But he's a guy who's averaging more than 2 blocks a game. He leads them in scoring and rebounding. He has been every bit as good and maybe even better than what Ed Cooley thought he was going to be. And Ed was very, very high on what Sorber was going to be able to do this season for the Hoyas. So, yeah, he's absolutely kind of a pivotal figure for this bunch. I don't know if he's necessarily the most valuable player for this team, but he's the best player on this team.
I'm curious because you mentioned, they hung with West Virginia for 26, 27 minutes there. He gets some foul trouble and things go downhill from there. Is this Georgetown team in a position where, say it's early second half and he's got a third foul or he picks up a fourth one midway through the second half, that things still kind of fall apart a little bit? Or is this team a little bit, gotten in more of a rhythm since then that they can withstand that?
Well, one of the problems that they have is that they have a freshman named Julius Halafanoa who's from New Zealand, and he played in 6 games, and he's a 7-footer, 270 pounds, really athletic, and he broke his ankle right after Thanksgiving during a
Okay.
practice, and so he's out for the season. So, in their dream scenario, like he would be the guy that they would have been able to send in case Sorber got into
Yeah.
foul trouble, and he's not as developed when healthy as Sorber is at this point, but it would have given them a pretty imposing presence. At this point, if Sorber's out, they basically either put Drew Fielder at the five,
Yep.
and Drew's more of a four than a five. I mean, he's bulked up and he's not getting thrown around the way he was last year as a freshman, but he's still not a Big East five man. Or they just end up going super small. If for whatever reason they don't have either of those, either Sorber or Fielder in the game. So the reason that Sorber's value, that it hurts if he gets into foul trouble isn't simply because he's really good. It's that they just don't have
Don't
that
have the
much
depth.
size behind him at this point.
Looking to add some local flavor to your lineup? Martin Rosel's is the MVP of your game day spread and a slam dunk for any occasion. Proudly made in hard-hit New Britain, their famous kielbasa and hot dogs have been a fan favorite for over 96 years. You can find their products in grocery stores across the state or have them delivered directly to your home court, coast to coast, via martinrosel.com. Take your taste buds to the championship and go support a Yukon fan-owned business. You talk about, who might be out. I know the Jaden Epps injury has been lingering a little bit. Do you know what the latest on him is as we get ready for Saturday here?
Yeah, I actually was not able to get over to their session today, but the way the timelines work that it's worked on is he got hurt late in the Seton Hall game. He went out and during pregame warmups last Friday at Xavier, it didn't look like he was he was capable of shooting, but it didn't look like he was capable of doing much else. And he
Mhm.
gave it a go for 4 minutes and just couldn't go with it. And I think at this point for Georgetown, I don't think they're going to rush him back because what there's still another 16 games or 15 games plus the conference tournament. I think it's much more important for them to have him healthy for 12, even if he's not
Yeah.
out there for the next 2 or 3 or whatever those numbers are, right? So I don't think they're going to try to rush him back at this point because it's frankly
Not worth it.
um, counterproductive if he's going
Yeah.
to go out and hurt himself some more. So the last word is day to day, but that's what we all are, right? So I think that as soon as he's fully ready to go, that he'll be back out there. But I'm not sure if that happens this game or maybe next game. So they're right now. They played Tuesday. They this past Tuesday, and then they go Saturday Yukon, Tuesday St. John's, Friday DePaul, Monday Villanova. So if you're back, that's a pretty heavy duty
Yeah.
stretch that you're
Getting
looking at.
thrown right back in
So
there. Yeah. When Dan Hurley and his staff are looking at this Georgetown team outside of Sorber, and if Epps isn't playing, who's the next guy or two guys that they're really keying in on?
Well, the two guys you're looking at that point are Malik Mack and Micah Peavy. And Mack is a guy who was the Ivy League Rookie of the Year at Harvard last season, and he has played pretty well in the absence of Epps. And he had been their primary ball handler for most of the season to this point. And he's a guy that there were times where it didn't quite look right. Like he was trying to feel everything out,
Hmm.
but he's also shooting almost 40% from three. So like the numbers look good, even if there were times he seemed a little disjointed, but he's been better of late. He had a great game, great second half in particular against Xavier. I think it was a 26-point game for him against the Musketeers. So that's a guy that's going to be a factor. And Peavy is a guy, this is a team that with him and Epps, those are the only two upperclassmen on the roster.
Hmm.
And Peavy, grad transfer from TCU, had been kind of a defensive specialist for the Horned Frogs. And part of the idea of coming to Georgetown was that not only was he going to do something to improve Georgetown's Matador defense, and he has, but he was also going to get the chance to play a more prominent role on offense, and he's also done that. He's basically had a lot of ball handling responsibilities with Epps on the sideline, and when I mentioned earlier that Sorber was their best player, but not their MVP, Micah Peavy's been their MVP because he has really galvanized them at the defensive end. You kind of look at what they were doing last year. I think they were 360th in 2-point percentage defense. They're like fifth this season. It's been such an amazing turnaround for them. I might be overselling that a little bit. Actually, no. 360 on Ken Palm last year in 2-point percentage defense, fifth this
That's
season.
crazy.
And he has had so much to do with that. You think about that Georgetown team last year. How many times did you just see somebody just kind of
Oh,
roll
yeah.
themselves, just glide to the basket? I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that Ed Cooley was already walking onto the court by the time a guy got to the foul line because he was going to
Yeah.
call a
Cut
timeout.
them out. Yeah.
So, that hasn't happened a whole lot this season. They have been much, much better. And Peavy's been such a big part of it. The thought that I had, the first time I watched him play in the season opener, it's like, well, there's a grown-up out there.
Yeah.
And like and Georgetown just hasn't had grown-ups on its roster. And I mean that not just because he's a fifth year guy, but because of the maturity and the toughness and all that stuff. So, I think that um, he's a guy that obviously has more ball handling responsibility if Epps isn't out there. But he's somebody that you have to account for at both ends of the floor. He's just been really, really fun to watch this season, just for everything that he's been able to bring to the table for them.
Yeah, I'll wrap with this one for you. We saw this Georgetown team hang with Marquette on the road for basically the full 40 minutes there. Assuming UConn's maybe a slight favorite in this one, what would it take in your mind, for Georgetown to be able to beat this UConn team?
Well, the thing is that they're going to get angry, Yukon, right? Like if Caravan makes those free throws the other night, it's probably not as cranky a Yukon team that's going to be making it down to DC. So I think that adds to the challenge for the Hoyas in this one anyway. But I think one thing they're going to have to do is they're going to have to shoot better from the outside than they have. And the reality is they only have three guys that have made even 10 3-pointers on the season, and one of them is Epps.
Yeah.
So they basically need Mac and Petey and maybe somebody else. And maybe that somebody else is a guy like Curtis Williams Jr., who's made a couple threes as his role has expanded. He's a Louisville transfer.
Okay.
Maybe that guy is Drew Fielder, who's capable of going out and popping a three. Maybe it's Caleb Williams, who's a freshman who has gotten a lot more playing time of late because of the opportunities. He's not necessarily somebody that jumps out at you when you first watch him
Yeah.
with his athleticism, but he's really smart and makes good decisions, and he doesn't hurt you in any way. And he's very opportunistic and is able to hit the glass on the offensive end. So they have some other guys that can do that, but I suspect that knowing that UConn's very good at taking away best options for others, that it's probably going to have there's probably going to have to be some 3-pointers coming from guys other than Mack and Petey in this game if Georgetown's going to be able to stick with this. That said, this is a better defensive team that Georgetown has, and maybe it can stick around in a game that's in the 60s. That's not something that you saw in the past. This year, they've already won a couple Big East games with winning scores in the 60s against both Xavier and Seton Hall. So certainly possible, but I also think it's going to be a team that's a bit motivated coming in from Stores this weekend.
Definitely. Well, Patrick, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for hopping on again. I hope everyone listening and watching checks out Patrick in the work he does. Does some great stuff. And if you're looking for stuff outside of sports, he does some great book recommendations too. I always am picking some up off your list. So, Patrick, thanks so much for hopping on again.
Thanks so much for having me.